Hello everyone and welcome to the second in our series of videos that we're recording at the moment. Today I'm joined by Professor Manuela Barreto, who is Head of Psychology at the University of Exeter. And a lot of Manuela's research focuses on loneliness and social isolation, connection, disconnection. So I'm going to be talking to Manuela today about how some of the risks that we might be facing in the current situation and how we can counteract them. So welcome, Manuela. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So if I could just start, as coronavirus spreads, more and more restrictions are placed on our movement around the world. And it can become harder for people to maintain social connections. What are some of the risks for well-being that people might be facing?
Well, it's of course a very worrying issue because social connection is so crucial to maintain both psychological and, surprisingly for some, physical well-being as well. So there's quite a lot of evidence that if people do not feel a sense of connection with others or with the community more generally, that can be really detrimental. It can even affect your immune system, which would of course make you more vulnerable to any disease, let alone a virus as evil as this one we're facing right now.
And are there any groups who are more susceptible than others to loneliness or social anxiety?
Yes, so of course we have there's quite a lot of research on this, and we find that there's a few characteristics that make people more vulnerable to feeling lonely. Now, we must also remember that feeling loneliness is not a problem in itself. So it's a little bit like, and we can talk about that separately as well, it's a little bit like anxiety. So it's aversive, it's not nice, but it's there and it performs a function. So when you're feeling lonely, really what that's doing to you is directing you towards the need that you have for social connection and to pay attention to that need by trying to find ways of connecting with others. In this situation, of course, we have to be creative about that because they're not going to be the same ways but that we usually use. But there are ways of remaining connected in this situation as well. So when we're talking about vulnerability, we need to think about vulnerability to what, right? So if we're vulnerable to feelings of loneliness, that's not necessarily bad as long as we can respond to that.
Yeah.
But if we can't respond to that, then that can take us to a place of chronic loneliness, which then is a problem. And so, of course, the most important question is who is vulnerable to not being able to address that feeling of loneliness and then entering a period of chronic loneliness, which indeed might make people withdraw completely and then become really quite difficult to address at that point. So that we will say, actually younger people are very vulnerable.
Okay.
We tend to think about older people as the most
Yeah.
vulnerable, and some studies do show that, but a lot of studies actually are now beginning not to show that as much, potentially because older people have lower expectations about sociality. So they don't expect to have as many friends and as much involvement in social events as younger people. And expectations are really a big thing in loneliness. So it is not just about how much contact you have with other people. It's about whether that's enough for you. And what's enough for you is by comparison to what's enough for those around you, to whom you compare yourself, your peers. So younger people tend to feel quite lonely at the moment. We do see that has quite clear evidence for that. For example, by a survey done with a representative sample of the UK population by the Office for National Statistics. So it's quite solid evidence. And that, of course, will have to do with the fact that young people are supposed to be socially connected at all times and in all ways. So if you feel that you're not meeting those standards, those expectations, then that's going to be a huge driver. So yes, younger people, but also people who are less advantaged. So first, for example, because there's more sources of disconnection, more sources of rejection and lack of acceptance by others. So that makes you vulnerable. But also potential because they have less access to all sorts of means through which you can connect to others. Financial means, it costs money to be sociable.
Yes, it does.
But also things like social media and the right types of social media, the right types of social activities that promote connection and belongingness in healthy ways, not just in ways that might actually put you at greater risk.
And how can kind of loneliness or the uncertainty that everyone's facing, how can that impact a person?
Well, so it can impact you in many ways. So, as I said before, it can impact you positively in the sense that you might actually be reminded of the value of your social connections and be more deliberate about them. So, instead of simply going out and being with whoever it is that crosses your path, which often are not chosen connections and therefore perhaps not the ones that most address your social needs, you might be a lot more deliberate about those. So, that is a silver lining we need to remember, right? So, the idea that okay, if you want to speak to someone or have a bit of a social moment, you might need to choose who that person is. You might need to give them a call. You might need to, for example, to think about those pictures you took together in your last event together, and so on. So it will have some positive impacts, but of course it also has some negative ones. So clearly. There might be people who don't think about social needs as a priority, who forget to think that those are really important. And so it will be by the end of a week, perhaps, that you will suddenly be feeling pretty down and not necessarily connecting that to the fact that you haven't really been seeing many people, or you've only been seeing those people you're stuck at home with, which, let's say, there's a negative and a positive side to that.
um, so is there anything that people should be looking out for? Like you say, we're not all that aware sometimes of if we're facing loneliness or anything like that. So are there any key signs that people should be kind of looking out
Yes,
for?
I would say the really important thing to think about is that one, sociality is really important. It is very crucial to stay connected. It's not a luxury need. It's not something that you look at once everything else is done. It's really important. It's a primary need, and it will affect everything else. So it needs to be looked out for. And two is that you need to be quite deliberate about it sometimes, because otherwise you will end up putting it low on your list of priorities. You will first go through all of the Netflix series, and then maybe you'll think about what your friends are doing. So that's a mistake, because it will I'm not even going to say in the long term. I think in the midterm it will already affect you very negatively. So what I would actually really recommend, it's a very practical thing, is to make sure that once a day at least you connect with other people, and that might be a phone call. Old-fashioned, but actually the sound of people's voices is really important for intimacy and the feeling of connection. Obviously, video calls will do the job very, very well too, because then you have the facial expression, which is also, again, really rich in communication, to be able to see other people's facial expressions. But then there are also things you can do without necessarily interacting with someone else. So I mentioned before, for example, the photographs, the photo albums, perhaps those that we haven't done at all because we kept all the photos in our phones.
Yeah.
And perhaps here's a moment to try and do that and spend some time really connecting with others simply by looking at those reminders of those connections, of your place in other people's lives and their place in yours. But really engage with it and not just, quickly look at your Facebook page, because
Yeah.
that's not going to do it. So I really think it's about prioritizing social connections and being very deliberate about them.
That's cool. That's cool. And is there anything that people can do to kind of look out for others? Given that we're not seeing each other on a daily basis anymore, in terms of physically meeting each other, any ways that people can look out for their friends and family?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the interesting things for a social psychologist like me about this pandemic is that, of course, aside from all the threat and the fear and the tragedy, there is the positive side of the collectivity that is behind it. So this is a collective threat, a collective fear, and that brings with it a lot of positive aspects. So one of the things people need to do is also to try and shift their frame of mind, which is quite subtle. It's something you need to do by yourself, into thinking of this as a collective thing. Once you do that, all sorts of opportunities open up. So, there are neighborhoods who are creating WhatsApp groups to keep an eye on each other, to offer each other help when, for example, you're going to the supermarket. Does anyone else need something? And that helps us all, because not only are you lending a hand to that particular person who asks for help, but you're also helping the community by minimizing people's exposure,
Yeah.
minimizing the amount of people who go out. There are people who are doing fabulous things and keeping a little bit an eye sources of community and volunteering and help is a good thing. Though I would also caution people to not allow themselves to too much exposure to negative news. So there's all sorts of things, even in very serious newspapers, that are really not helping, in terms of mood and keeping spirits up. So, to try and direct yourself away from that and into those positive news pieces, the even the jokes that are going around, those jokes and humor are a great source of connection. So it's not just that you're laughing and that might lift your mood as well, is that you're laughing and you're thinking about how other people are also enjoying that.
Okay,
and you're thinking about whom to send it to and so on. So, those things are good. Those things are what we should be trying to spend time with.
Excellent. And just finally, do you think, social media and all the digital tools and things, do you think they can be more positive at times like this? They can have a bit of a bad rap.
Sure. And I think, the bad reputation they have is actually a little bit unfair. So what research shows in general, even outside this current situation, is that technology in general and social media in particular are not necessarily bad for you, even in terms of social connections. I know that we have this idea that, kids don't leave their phones alone and that has killed their sociality and so on. Quite the opposite. So the key is not, is technology bad or good for you? The key is to think about what exactly are we doing with the technology, and are we using it to extend our social connections, or are you using it to replace our social connections? So usually the knowledge is pointing to the fact that when we're using them to extend our social connections, for example, when kids get out of the bus and immediately start texting the friend they've just left behind, that's an extension of a social connection. They do that, as incredible as it may sound, but it's not a replacement, right? It's a way of extending that friendship that exists offline, and it's very rich offline, and that is just a helping hand. If, however, you are sat at home and going through the internet to look for a friend, that is not the right way to go about it. Now, what we're doing in this crisis is not necessarily going online to make new friends. We are indeed replacing face-to-face contact, but not in terms of new interactions. It's the extension of those friendships that we need to focus on. I would also say that it's important for employers to think about this too. So, of course, a lot of us are still working. We are trying to carry on more or less as normal in this abnormal environment. But we need to make sure that in these remote meetings that we have, that we do try to put in a bit of that sociality that we would otherwise do. People would sit down with a cup of coffee. People would perhaps ask whether you want a cup of coffee. We can't really do that. What we can do is ask about each other. How are you doing? How are you coping with this situation? And that the little bit of sharing that happens there might exactly be that the bit of intimacy that person has that day, and that helps them de-stress in relation to all the overload that the situation is creating for some people.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I think that's some really good advice there for people to try and keep their connections, to keep feeling positive, and to also help out in their community. So thank you very much, Manuela, for joining us for these few minutes, for making time in these strange circumstances while we're all working at home. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone enjoyed watching. Thank you very much.
Welcome.